This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. Today we are joined by author Emily C. Hughes. She is the former editor of Unbound Worlds at tornightfire.com, has been a name in the horror literature space for nearly a decade, and emerges now with her first book, Horror for Weenies, Everything You Need to Know About the Films You're Too Scared to Watch, out now with Quirk Books. With her funny, insightful voice, Hughes walks curious but cowardly readers through the plots and iconic scenes of 25 influential horror movies, ensuring they'll get the references without having to sit through the scares. This is the first installment in the Outsider's Guide series, which offers entertaining and accessible crash courses in major pop culture moments for folks who never want to be left out of the cultural conversation.
So, podcast listeners, for this episode, we are doing an interview with Emily C. Hughes, the author of Horror for Weenies, Everything You Need to Know About the Films You're Too Scared to Watch. Emily, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you here.
Oh, thank you guys so much for having me. I am thrilled to be here.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and take you into our first question, which is why horror? What sparked your interest in this genre?
You know, I've always had kind of just a macabre uh little brain. um when I was a kid, I was always drawn to the weird stuff, even when I was sitting there reading those little DK eyewitness books, with all the pictures, and it would be like medieval castles or whatever. I would be like, oh, I want to look at the torture chamber in the medieval castles book, or I want to look at the venomous snakes in the snake book. I want to see the world's deadliest shark in the fish book. um and so I was always kind of looking toward the like darker, weirder, scarier part of the world even before I got to fiction. And as a kid, I was really into, the John Belair's books, with those incredible Edward Gorey illustrations. I wasn't so much a Goosebumps kid. Uh, I don't know, I was really into, the stories of, it was the Lemony Snicket books that really did it for me too. Just the weird dark stuff always kind of drew me in, and as I got older I started to kind of curate my taste around horror fiction, and that became both a passion and a career for me. I worked in book publishing for a long time, and throughout all of that, horror movies were the one thing that I was never really confident about. I had had a 10th birthday sleepover where we had rented Poltergeist, of all things, which was a really bad idea for a bunch of scared 10-year-old girls. And so that really kind of put me off horror in like a visual medium for a long time. But it was horror fiction that kind of brought me back around to that. And so I guess it's kind of a lifelong interest.
All right. Well, I'm really curious because this is such it reads like an essential list of horror. Like if you're going to pick all the movies that people need to know about, it's in here. And I'm curious to know how did you decide on which movies were essential enough like to make your cut for the list? And maybe a second part to that question is, were there movies that you wanted to include but for whatever reason you felt like you couldn't?
The Oh my god, the initial version of the list. So there are 25 movies in the finished book. My initial kind of brainstorm list for this was almost 50 movies. It was incredibly hard to cut that down. I had a real like, oh, my eyes are bigger than my stomach thing, where I was like, no, I'm definitely going to talk about all of these movies and it's going to be fine and I'm going to make it work. I was incorrect. I didn't do any of that. I, as I started writing, it became way more apparent that it was like, okay, no, you actually have to give a lot of consideration to each of these movies. And it does take a long time to really go and do these like blow by blow synopses. And that's before you even get to like the research and writing on sort of the analytical essays. Um, so I very quickly was disabused of the notion that I was going to get like 50 movies into this book, into this, sub 300 page book. Um, and so as I was cutting that down, at first I was sort of like, okay, there are some that I had on this list that are just personal favorites, but I can't really make the argument that they were like especially important to the ongoing horror canon. And those were movies like, I mean, Event Horizon is kind of the one that got away. Like, I can in no way argue that that's like a really influential horror film, but I do love it. It's one of my all-time favorites. And then it got to sort of, okay, what are the redundancies here? I really love The Omen as well, and that's one that I was like, okay, I feel like this is pretty influential, but it wasn't doing anything that, I kind of hadn't already covered with two earlier and like definitely more influential religious horror movies, which were Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. Um, and so I ended up having to cut the entry on The Omen, which kind of broke my heart a little bit. And then there were movies that I kind of talked myself out of at the time in the like temporary madness that is writing a book. You're like, you're just kind of in an altered state. Um, I had talked myself out of including Alien for some reason. I can't remember what the justification was now, but I've been kicking myself ever since. I was like, really, Alien of all the movies? And there were some others that I really would have loved to include that, there just simply wasn't enough space. The Descent, Silence of the Lambs, God, Jaws. I mean, my like North Star horror movie. But think I kind of landed on, well, it's more of a creature feature, thriller, blah blah blah. Um, so it was very difficult, but I do feel good about where I landed with the table of contents. I feel like, okay, this is a representative sample specifically of American horror cinema of the last 65 years, but it would have had to be a much, much, much longer book for me to kind of go outside the boundaries of America, which I would have loved to do.
Well, and I will say that even though, yeah, as you were describing, like Jaws and Alien and Event Horizon, which that was the horror movie for me. I think that really like solidified the fact that I was a fan of the genre. But I think it's important to note too that you weren't just giving like summaries and fun facts here, but that you did include so much of the like horror criticism that was important to it. I don't know. This really isn't a question, but I was just so glad to see names that I love and respect, like W. Scott Poole or Jason Zinneman, and I don't know. I think the ones that you did end up landing on were both, I think, culturally significant, but also in that kind of critical canon too. So it was really well done.
Thank you. That's honestly, that means a lot because I think those references, especially to sort of horror criticism and horror history, were really important for me to include because I, really strongly believe in like crediting the people who kind of made you the writer or the thinker or the, artist that you are. And those people were all really formative for me. And that's why I included that sort of, more reading, more viewing page in the back of the book. Just, okay, if this really piqued your interest, here are the people you should go seek out next. And honestly, like half of my career thus far has been going, hey, go read this book. And so I wasn't going to stop now.
So, I have to ask. I think you may have answered this first part of this question, but do you consider yourself a weenie when it comes to the scary movies, or are you more of the lover of horror movies?
I consider myself a reformed weenie at this point. I was definitely a weenie for a long time. I was the person that we targeted this book at. I was the person who was sitting there reading the Wikipedia plot synopsis of whatever movie my friends were talking about because I knew I was never going to go see it. Joke's on me. I've now seen it, whatever it was. I've come, so far around the other side of it that I'm a voracious horror consumer. And the thing that really, changed that for me was horror fiction. And it's what I really found myself drawn to as an adult. And I remember specifically the book that kind of made me go, oh, I need to be paying attention to this. It was Bird Box by Josh Malerman, which I was working in publishing at the time, and the editor had just acquired the manuscript, and I got a hold of it, and I was just like riveted, single sitting read, like blew the top of my head off. I was just like, oh, this is what I've been looking for. Um, and so after enough years of really kind of devouring as much scary fiction as I could get my hands on, I was like, well, I should probably give the movies another shot. Uh, and with the benefit of a lot more sort of genre experience under my belt, and also, being an adult and not a teenager or a child, that also helped. Um, I came back to this whole art form and had this whole new appreciation for it. And I had to play some catch up because, I'd missed a lot of years in the intervening couple decades. I didn't have that phase of high school where, I was watching weird VHS rentals with my friends. I mean, they just weren't horror movies. Um, so I did have to kind of do some backfilling on that front, but it was totally worth it. I mean, it's a joyous project to undertake.
Well, and I guess related to that, I know we all, uh, three of us within the as hosts, we have our own leanings within horror that we tend to gravitate to, that we kind of prefer certain aspects of the genre more than others. But like for me, I am not a fan at all of torture porn or things like that. Just don't like it. Is there anything that you just won't watch, or something you draw the line at?
There's nothing that's like a hard no 100% of the time for me. A lot of it is context dependent. I'm not really one for like your old stuff, like 70s era like rape revenge movies. That's like very much not for me. Um, but then, I watched apologies, I have not actually internalized how to pronounce her last name, but the director of The Substance, Coralie Farjad, my French is atrocious, sorry. Her previous movie, which is called Revenge, is a rape revenge movie, and that was something that for a long time I had just been like, no, I'm not doing that. But I watched it. It's fucking terrific. I had a great time with it. It's extremely well handled, and part of that is it being a female director instead of apologies to Wes Craven, but Wes Craven. Um, so I don't know. Every time I think I draw a line for myself, I find the exception. um, so there are, I won't watch like the really, really extreme hardcore, like, Salo 120 Days of Sodom, or, like a Serbian film, like those really hardcore extreme ones. I still want there to be a story and a plot and some sort of, cinematic merit. Um, I tend to gravitate towards supernatural and paranormal over, kind of slashers, human monsters, murderer, serial killer, that kind of thing. I love an ancient evil. Anytime I see the phrase "an ancient evil," I am seated. I'm ready. I have my popcorn. I used to think I didn't really like body horror. I was incorrect about that too. I mean, I saw The Substance last weekend and I haven't stopped thinking about it and I'm aching to watch it again. Uh no, honestly, I'm kind of all over the map. I really like, I would say it's I'm drawn to things more than I'm like put off by things. So I'm drawn to folk horror. I'm drawn to really inventive kills or scares. I watched Damian Rugna's Terrified, Aterados, last week, and that had, like, you kind of feel like you've seen all the jump scares, and then all of a sudden you get a jump scare that really just, kicks you in the butt and is like, hey, no, this genre can really still surprise you. And there was a jump scare in that movie that made me shriek. I do not scream at horror movies. That's just not my general vibe, but this was a sound that came from the depths of my soul. And it's just nice to continue to be surprised like that.
I feel like you and Lisa need to talk about The Substance.
Yeah, I was trying so hard not to interrupt you as you were talking because I adore body horror and yeah, I haven't stopped thinking about that movie either.
It's so good. She really goes there. I'm that third
She
act, I
does.
mean, no spoilers, but that third act, I was just like,
Yes.
there's no way to predict when you start that movie where you're going to end that movie.
No, there's no way to predict it, and yet it feels like that was the exact trajectory we were going on.
Oh my
I
god, so
loved it.
good.
Um, well, okay, I'm gonna because you brought up like Bird Box, and I know you talk about this a little bit in the book itself. Because so listeners, this book, it kind of takes the 25 essential horror films and breaks them down into, the plot beat by beat, I mean, kind of not unlike, I guess, reading like the back of a summary of a book or something. Although it goes more in depth, then puts it in some sort of like cultural context. Um, there's fun facts that I was surprised some of them I didn't even know. Um, but then you have movie recommendations, book recommendations after each movie. So it's kind of books that are thematically related. So I guess if you are too much of a weenie and you need to read the book, um, instead, you do have that, which I really love. I love this connection of horror films and horror books. But my question to you is, how does like the act of reading versus watching change how you experience horror? Because I've heard a lot of people say that they can't watch horror movies, but they can read horror books, which kind of blows my mind because I don't know. I feel like horror, when I read it, seeps deeper into my bones, and kind of scares me a lot more than when I watch it. But I don't know. How does it change the way we experience horror when we're reading a book or watching a movie?
So I do think there's kind of a spectrum here because I hear what you're saying, Lisa, from other people as well, which is, no, it's scarier when I read it, because you're metabolizing it differently when it's coming through visual images than when it's coming through text. And for me personally, text is easier, because it's like I've got a soundboard in front of me and I can sort of adjust the sliders. Like, okay, this author is telling me about a monster, and it's a monster that for whatever reason is really scary to me or really repulsive to me or whatever. And I'm not in a place where I can really deal with that right now. Sometimes I am. Right now I'm not. I'm just gonna turn down the maybe gooiness level like 30%, and I'm not that, not that I'm doing that like granularly in the moment, but I can just kind of adjust what my mental image is when I'm reading. because there is that collaborative element of reading between the author and the reader. The author is coming a certain percent of the way, and then the reader kind of has to fill in the rest in their head, and that's part of the relationship. With a movie, that relationship does still exist, but it's not about the development of like the visual image. You're being presented a visual image, and they're saying, here's what this is. And also we have the technology to add sound design and soundtracks and cinematography choices and interesting costuming and performance choices by the actors. um, so there's a lot more that goes into it that can scare you in a movie. I mean, there are a lot more elements sort of working together to scare you. And for me, I'm also somebody who occasionally has sensory issues. So like that music sting in a jump scare, it like kind of just really gets under my skin in a different way. But when I read, I can just sort of, I can keep my own level when I need to. But like I said, this is something that I've when I talk about this, I kind of hear responses that are all over the map. So I think it's as individual as what scares me and what scares you are totally different, and the way we interpret visual versus text may be totally different as well.
That's really interesting because I've always been a person that kind of prefers reading scary things to watching them because the visual uh, is stronger for me. It's like it's scarier for me. I don't know if it's because I can, as you were saying, kind of control it by reading, or I feel like it's contained in a way. But yeah, I've always been that kind of a person where the visual aspect and I guess probably the soundtrack and all these things that you're talking about are adding to it. And so yeah, I've just always kind of preferred to read. So for me, I found your book really fascinating, and I loved the idea of, like Lisa said, mixing the books in with the movies. Like, well, if you can't watch this movie, or if you watched it and you like it, you can go check out this other media, which I thought was really cool. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, but play off of something that Lisa mentioned, and that is that you had these moments with the movies where you had little fun facts about them, and we were wondering, do you have a favorite fun fact or two that you would like to highlight?
I really can't get over the one. So I was really trying not to just like regurgitate the IMDb trivia section with those. And sometimes there's like a piece of information that is so like you just have to share it, and okay, yeah, fine, it's also the thing a lot of people know about this movie, but everybody's learning it for the first time at some point, right? um and this was kind of interesting when I was going through the writing process. My editor, Jess Zimmerman, who is wonderful, is a self-professed weenie, and so I was kind of able to bounce things off her and go like, does your average weenie know this, or am I just like way overthinking this? So one example of this was the mask that Michael Myers wears in Halloween is a William Shatner mask, spray painted white and with the eye holes enlarged. And I had internalized that so long ago that I was like, oh, well, everybody knows that. So I didn't include it in the entry about Halloween. And then as we were starting to get into edits, one of Jess's notes on that entry was, hey, I just learned this thing about the mask. I was like, all right, fine. That's got to go in there. Um, but there were, bits and pieces of information that I was coming across uh, that really stuck with me. And the one that stuck with me the most was the anecdote about Tony Todd in Candyman negotiating himself a per sting bonus for the scene where all the bees come out of his mouth, because that wasn't a special effect. There were really bees coming out of his mouth. And so he negotiated himself $1,000 per bee sting on top of his, agreed upon salary for the movie. And that's how he ended up with an extra, I believe it was $23,000.
That was a really smart thing to negotiate.
Right? Like that's businessman shit. That's foresight.
I feel like I just want to add that because I feel like that I don't know. I've watched horror for so long and I've read so much about horror for so long that I didn't think that there would be things that would surprise me. Um, because as you said, everybody learns things kind of at a different pace, which I think we take for granted a lot, especially those of us who get really excited about a subject and want to like go on such a deep dive that we write books about it. Um, but I had no idea that Mel Brooks had any connection at all to The Fly, which is one of my favorite movies. And that has now delighted me just to know that. So I don't know. I was glad to know that one.
That one is particularly wonderful because it kind of just gives you this other side of Mel Brooks if you're someone who also grew up with Mel Brooks movies, which I did. And it's just like the idea of him sitting there and just like casually dropping the iconic line, be afraid, be very afraid, in like a meeting on the back end of this with Cronenberg and like one of the other producers. And it's just like, how can that be true? How can that be real? And it is, and it's just a wonderful weird fact.
It is a wonderful, weird fact. All right. Well, part of what you do in this is take these movies and you do put them into the cultural context. And we've talked about this a little bit about how you do kind of talk a lot about the horror criticism that goes into it. But I'm curious to know why you felt like that was important because it would have been, I think, a great book had you just said, okay, this is what this book is about. Here are some fun facts. Here are some book recommendations and left it at that. But you take the time to really put it into the cultural context and explain, I think, why each of these films is important. I think both in the genre, but also beyond the genre. And I was wondering, I don't know what led you to include that in the book? Why was it important to put these horror movies in a cultural context for your for your audience?
So one of my majors in college was art history, which might explain a lot about me. And I had, the whole of art history is literally just cultural context. It's like I am looking at this beautiful painting, and in order to fully understand it and explain it, I need, several different books on the history of, I don't know, let's say British exploration in the South Pacific in the 1800s or whatever, Um, and so that has really shaped how I think about art in any form. One of my favorite things to do is, sit around and watch a movie with my husband and just like talk about what we think its influences were and what kind of traditions we think it was in. So this is also something I do for fun. This is just kind of who I am as a person for better and for worse. Um, but the context is what makes it interesting to me. Like a movie on its own is fun, yeah, but when you start like kind of chewing on the connective tissue around it, that's where the meat is for me. Um, because art doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, every piece of art that has ever been made is responding to something else, whether that's another piece of art or whether it's a relationship the creator was having or a problem they were dealing with, or something traumatic that they'd just been through, like a war or a famine. This is art is how humans tell stories about what we're going through, what we're experiencing, what we're living. um and I think without that context, you're just missing what makes it interesting, what makes it important. So there was never a version of this book in my head that existed without those sections. Like those sections were kind of not why I wrote it, but they were the pieces of it that were there for me, I guess.
Yeah, I love that historization and contextualization that you did. I think, you're right. I mean, all art comes out of a conversation with things that influenced it, and then it influences what's to come. So I love the kind of trajectory that you had in your little like mini essays, moving from kind of almost time period to time period within the book. it really worked really well, kind of building on each one. And I thought it goes back to what Lisa was saying about having the horror critics in your work. You're in conversation with them, just like the movies are in conversation with each other. And I just thought that was so wonderfully woven together. That's not really a question; it's more of a comment, but I enjoyed that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was like I didn't want to like pretend like all of these insights were my own was part of it, right? Like I'm not just some like brilliant, I'm not calling myself brilliant, that's weird. Um I'm not just some sort of like prodigy who came up with all of this stuff on her own. I know it because I read and because I seek out this information and I seek out this cultural context and I seek out these other writers and follow what they're doing and follow their careers. W. Scott Poole could write the phone book next and I'd still read it. Um, but yeah, it was just kind of, I don't know, there was like an honesty component to it. It was like, yeah, no, you should also read these people who've been doing this longer. And like this, horror for weenies, it's like, it's not an academic text, right? It's not like heavy, hardcore cultural criticism, but it was important to me that that was part of the conversation, I guess.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Lisa, Matt, I feel like we have run through our questions. Do you guys have any follow-ups?
My only follow up is that I think if you have 50 films on a list, we could have Horror for Weenies Part 2,
From your lips to God's ears, we gotta see how the sales go, but I could easily do it.
I
I
would read
told
it.
my I told my editor, I said, look, this book easily could have been 25 movies just since the year 2000. It easily could have been just 25 ghost stories that defined like the last half century of American horror cinema. It could have been all folk horror. It could have been all, non-American horror. It could have been all zombies, oops, all zombies. But, hopefully people buy it and I get to write more of these.
Oh, we will be eagerly awaiting the sequels. Thank you so much for joining us, Emily. This was a great conversation.
Thank you guys so much. Yeah, Matt, Mel, Lisa, really wonderful to talk to you all. Thank you for your insightful questions. And thank you for having me.
We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram, and we have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, please consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.